Officer Hal Brennan had worked the downtown foot patrol for 8 years, and in that time, he had developed a private conviction that the city's newer, glass-fronted restaurants, the kind that had replaced the older, working-class diners he remembered from his childhood, belonged to a certain kind of clientele, and that anyone who fell outside his private sense of that clientele warranted a second look. Justice Odalis Marchand did not, in Brennan's estimation, look like she belonged at the corner table of Fontaine's on a Thursday evening, despite the fact that she had eaten at that exact restaurant on the third Thursday of nearly every month for the past 6 years, a quiet, private ritual she maintained with an old law school friend who had nothing to do with her professional life and everything to do with the ordinary human need to occasionally be simply a person having dinner rather than a sitting justice of the state's highest court. She wore, that evening, a simple cream sweater and dark trousers, her state-issued security detail seated at a discreet table near the entrance rather than beside her, per her own long-standing preference to keep her Thursday dinners as unremarkable as possible. It was this discretion, ironically, that gave Brennan the opening his private instincts had apparently been waiting for. He was working an off-duty security shift for the restaurant that night, a common arrangement for officers looking to supplement their income, and it was in that capacity, rather than any actual policing duty, that he approached her table roughly 20 minutes into her dinner. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification." Odalis looked up from her plate, mild surprise crossing her face at the interruption. "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" "We've had some incidents with people coming in and running up a tab they can't cover. Restaurants asked me to check ID on some tables tonight." It was not, in fact, true. A fabrication Brennan had constructed on the spot, built entirely from a private, unexamined assessment of who at Fontaine's warranted this particular brand of scrutiny and who didn't. An assessment that had, notably, not extended to any of the other tables he'd walked past on his way to hers. "I'd be happy to show identification if that's genuinely the restaurant's policy tonight, though I'd note you haven't approached any other table since I've been sitting here." Odalis's tone remained mild, unhurried, the particular calm of a woman who had encountered this exact flavor of scrutiny more times across her career than she cared to enumerate at her own quiet Thursday dinner. "May I ask specifically what prompted you to select this table?" "I'm just doing my job, ma'am. I need to see your ID." Her friend, a retired attorney named Rosalind Kemp, who had known Odalis since their first year of law school, and had watched, over 3 decades, more instances of exactly this kind of scrutiny than she cared to count either, set down her fork with a controlled, deliberate motion. "Officer, I think you should reconsider this approach." "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." At the table near the entrance, Deputy Marshal Renata Voss, the senior member of Justice Marchand's 3-person state security detail, present at every one of these Thursday dinners, regardless of the justice's own preference for discretion, precisely because discretion and security were never, in Voss's professional judgment, mutually exclusive, had already clocked the interaction the moment Brennan approached the table, and had risen from her own seat within seconds of his first sentence, moving with the unhurried, purposeful economy of someone whose entire training was built around recognizing exactly this kind of escalating situation before it fully escalated. Part 2. The Detail Steps. Voss reached the table in under 15 seconds, her credential already extended, her voice carrying the particular controlled authority of someone who had spent a career de-escalating exactly this kind of encounter without ever once needing to raise her voice to do it. "Deputy Marshal Renata Voss, State Judicial Security Division. I need you to step back from this table, officer." Brennan turned, visibly startled by the sudden appearance of a second, unfamiliar authority figure, his private certainty flickering for the first time since he'd approached the table. "This is a restaurant matter. I'm working private security tonight. I don't need—" "You approached a sitting justice of this state's Supreme Court and demanded identification under a fabricated pretext in front of two witnesses at the neighboring table who can confirm you selected this table specifically and no other in the restaurant." Voss's tone remained level, though something in it had sharpened into something considerably less patient. "I'd strongly recommend you step back now, before this becomes something considerably more serious than a misunderstanding at dinner." "A justice? She's just—" Brennan stopped himself, the sentences ending too transparent even to his own diminishing certainty to finish out loud. "Finish that sentence, officer, and I promise you it becomes part of the formal complaint I'm about to file." Voss's gaze didn't waver. "Justice Odalis Marchand has sat on this state's highest court for 6 years. She is entitled to eat dinner at this restaurant on this Thursday exactly as unremarkably as every other patron in this room, without being singled out by an off-duty officer whose only actual basis for approaching her table was a snap judgment he made the moment he looked at her." The restaurant had gone quiet around them, other diners glancing over with the particular uncomfortable attention of people sensing they were witnessing something they weren't yet fully able to parse the scale of. Odalis, for her part, remained seated, calm, watching the exchange with an expression that carried neither surprise nor particular alarm. The composed patience of a woman who had built, over a long career, a considerable capacity for allowing exactly this kind of moment to play out without needing to intervene personally, because she understood with total clarity that her own security detail's professional handling of the situation would matter considerably more in the long run than anything she might say herself in the heat of the moment. "I want your name, badge number, and your supervising department," Voss continued. "And I want the restaurant's manager over here within the next 30 seconds, because I intend for this to be documented in full before you leave this building tonight." Brennan, his certainty having fully collapsed into a dawning, uncomfortable recognition of exactly how badly he had misjudged the entire situation, produced his information with hands that had lost the confident ease they'd carried when he first approached the table. "I didn't know who she was." "That's precisely the problem, officer," Odalis said, speaking for the first time since Voss's arrival, her voice carrying no anger, only a flat, unhurried clarity that landed with more weight than raised fury would have. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with basic professional courtesy. You needed only to extend to my table the same baseline assumption of legitimacy you extended to every other table in this restaurant tonight. The fact that you didn't isn't a mistake that gets corrected once you learn my title. It's a pattern that would have continued indefinitely if my title hadn't happened to force this correction." Part 3. What the robe revealed. The restaurant's manager, once summoned, offered an apology considerably more thorough than the situation might have received under different circumstances, and confirmed, under Voss's direct and pointed questioning, that no restaurant policy requiring spot identification checks existed, had ever existed, or had been communicated to any off-duty officer working security that night. The formal complaint Voss filed the following morning did not remain a quiet, internal matter for long. Justice Marchand's judicial security detail operated under a state oversight structure entirely separate from Brennan's own municipal police department, a structural distinction that meant the complaint carried weight and visibility that an ordinary citizen's account, however credible, often struggled to generate on its own. Not because Odalis sought that visibility, which she had in fact initially hoped to avoid, preferring to let the incident be handled through professional channels rather than public attention, but because the involvement of a state judicial security division investigating a municipal officer's conduct toward a sitting justice was, by its nature, difficult for either institution to quietly minimize. "I want to be careful about how this gets characterized," Odalis said, in the single public statement she eventually agreed to give, after the incident had already begun circulating through local media, despite her preference for a quieter resolution. "This is not a story about a justice being disrespected, though certainly that happened. It's a story about the ordinary, unremarkable ease with which an officer decided, within seconds and without any actual evidence, that I didn't belong at a table I have sat at, undisturbed, for 6 years. That ease is the actual subject worth examining. My title simply ensured the examination happened at all." The Municipal Police Department's internal review, conducted under direct pressure from the State Judicial Security Division's own parallel investigation, uncovered what had by now become an almost predictable pattern in these kinds of cases. 2 prior complaints against Brennan during his off-duty security work at other establishments, both alleging similarly unfounded, selectively applied scrutiny toward black patrons, both resolved previously with nothing beyond an informal verbal warning that had never once appeared in any formal disciplinary file. Brennan was terminated from both his off-duty security contract and, within the month, from the police department itself, the department's disciplinary board citing not only the incident at Fontaine's, but the 2 prior, inadequately addressed complaints as evidence of an established pattern rather than an isolated lapse in judgment. Justice Marchand returned to Fontaine's the following month for her regular Thursday dinner with Rosalind Kemp, a small, deliberate act of reclaiming an ordinary ritual that had been disrupted, however briefly, by an encounter she had no intention of allowing to reshape the quiet corners of her life that mattered most to her. "People ask me, sometimes, whether I feel that justice was served," she told a legal affairs journalist, in the only formal interview she gave on the matter, conducted months after the incident had concluded. "I think about the 2 complaints before mine, from patrons whose names I'll likely never know, whose accounts were quietly dismissed because neither of them happened to have a state security detail capable of transforming a dinner-table misunderstanding into an investigation nobody could simply set aside. I did not experience anything that night that those 2 patrons hadn't already experienced. I simply had, by circumstance rather than any particular virtue of my own, the institutional weight to ensure it was finally taken seriously. I would like it understood, plainly, that the actual failure here was never really about one officer's judgment on one Thursday evening. It was about how long that judgment had already been operating, unexamined and unaddressed, before it happened to reach a table where it couldn't quietly continue." Deputy Marshal Voss, for her part, offered a considerably shorter reflection when asked by the same journalist what the incident had taught her about her own work protecting the justices' Thursday dinners. "It taught me that discretion and vigilance aren't actually in tension the way people sometimes assume," she said. "Justice Marchand values her privacy, and I respect that completely. But respecting it never meant sitting far enough away to miss what was happening at her table. It meant sitting close enough to reach her in 15 seconds when it mattered, and staying quiet enough the rest of the time that most people in that restaurant never once noticed I was there at all. Until, on one particular Thursday, they very much needed to." The end.